sudden crackling voice, distorted by static, jolted me out of the deep concentration I had sunk into. I had been fixated on the rain-drenched path ahead, steering my Jeep cautiously through the muddy trail. The downpour was so fierce that maintaining my position within the lane was proving to be a challenge. I proceeded slowly, threading my way through the palmetto shrubs that flanked both sides of the 4x4 vehicle. Bringing the Jeep to a gentle halt in the middle of the desolate road, I relinquished my tight grip on the steering wheel. I reached for the handset situated on the dashboard, battling the relentless assault of wind and rain on the Jeep's canvas top, which made it difficult to discern the incoming communication. I adjusted the volume before formulating my response. "Jess, it's Sam. The storm is causing interference, but I can still make out your signal." "What's going on?" I answered, briefly rubbing the bridge of my nose and affording my eyes a momentary rest. The strain was developing into a headache, and I eagerly anticipated completing my designated area before rendezvousing at the prearranged meeting point. The day had already been arduous, and the pressure of navigating through the unrelenting rain and treacherous conditions was beginning to take its toll. "Sam, what's your status?" "The other team members have concluded their routes and are either back here or in transit," Jess inquired, her voice tinged with concern. She would be more reassured if my partner Paul were accompanying me today, but he had departed with his family 2 days earlier, leaving no available replacements. I had to engage in a convincing argument with the coordinator to gain approval for my solo venture. Eventually she relented, recognizing the impending peril posed by the colossal hurricane bearing down on southwest Florida. The official emergency services were fully engaged in storm preparations, suspending evacuation checks since the previous afternoon. Fortunately, over time, several volunteer emergency groups had emerged from the multitude of local off-road clubs. These groups frequently collaborated with authorities, undertaking a range of tasks spanning fundraising to search and rescue missions and beyond. Over the years, I had participated in numerous endeavors encompassing this spectrum. On this particular day, our mission entailed visiting the sparse inhabitants of Lonely Key, a diminutive barrier island along the Gulf Coast. Stretching merely a mile across and 5 miles end to end, this island was connected to the mainland solely via a narrow 2-lane bridge. On the Key, there existed a few modest housing communities and a mobile home park. Additionally, several homes were scattered across the mostly undeveloped southern region. The locale embodied the vintage Florida aesthetic, with the majority of houses being adorned with stucco, pastel shades, carports, and jalousie windows. A substantial portion of these abodes was inhabited by elderly retirees who reveled in their later years amidst the balmy coastal air. This demographic presented a predicament, as their ability to evacuate swiftly during emergencies, especially one as formidable as the imminent Category 4 hurricane, was severely compromised. The ethical dilemma of leaving them to face their fates in the wake of such a perilous storm was undeniable. "I'm just about finished here, Jess," I conveyed. "Unfortunately, the residences towards the southern end are widely spaced and can only be reached via dirt roads. It's impeding my progress significantly." A brief silence followed, during which I sensed Jess deliberating. Eventually, her voice emerged through the crackling of the communication. "Sam, I believe you should abandon your current tasks and head straight back to the designated meeting point. The latest radar data indicates that the hurricane's trajectory has shifted closer to us and is gaining momentum. It's currently moving at 15 knots east-northeast and is projected to directly impact us. The situation is bound to be extremely dire." I took a moment's pause, my gaze shifting from the rain-smeared window on my side to the muddy and narrow road ahead through the windshield. "I'm just left with one more house to inspect, Jess. Irrespective of that, I'm not comfortable with the idea of leaving anyone stranded out here in the face of this catastrophe. Moreover, there's no viable turning point here. Attempting to do so might result in getting stuck on the road's edge." Another protracted silence ensued, her response revealing her internal struggle amidst the fragile connection. "All right, Sam, the decision is yours to make. Though I'm apprehensive, if you can conclude the check on the final residence and promptly make your way back, I'll support your choice. Note that the state troopers have agreed to keep the bridge accessible for you, yet their patience won't last indefinitely. Should you dawdle, you might find yourself marooned on the Key until the storm subsides." Understood, I affirmed. I'll notify you once I start my return journey. It shouldn't take much longer. Affirmative. Stay safe, Sam, and maintain communication, she concluded. Sure thing, Jess. I'll talk to you soon. I hung up the phone and took a deep breath. I questioned my decision for a moment, wondering if it was the right one. The road ahead was narrow, but I believed I could turn around and go back if needed. The truth was, this entire area would likely be submerged in several feet of water within the next 12 hours, due to the relentless downpour and the impending storm surge. Houses not raised on stilts would be in serious trouble. I tried not to think about what that meant for the residents, especially those with limited mobility. I shifted the Jeep into gear and gently pressed the throttle. The mud tires struggled in the slippery mud at first, but eventually found traction and moved me forward along the road. The wind was fierce, causing the heavy 4x4 to sway, and the rain to pound against the metal with a deafening noise. Nonetheless, I maintained my speed and cautiously continued on the winding road. After another 15 minutes, a journey that would typically take only 2 or 3, the road abruptly led to a small cul-de-sac and merged with a crushed shell driveway. A weathered mailbox leaned at an odd angle from the strong wind, its numbers barely readable. However, the specific address didn't matter. This was the last house on the southern end of the key. I turned onto the driveway and felt relieved as the tires regained traction. A couple more minutes of navigating brought the house into view as I rounded the final bend. The house stood beyond the flailing palm trees and pines, its surroundings now clear in the open space. Past the house, the trees and palmetto bushes ceased, revealing a full view of the raging waters of the Gulf of Mexico. It felt uncomfortably close and menacing, a stark departure from its usually calm demeanor. Despite the rain, which was nearly horizontal due to the powerful winds, I could see massive swells and turbulent whitecaps advancing from the distance. Even within the safety of my Jeep and on solid ground, I couldn't help but be awed by the might of the approaching hurricane. It was forcing violent waves far beyond their usual reach, dangerously encroaching upon my current position. I had hoped the house would be empty so I could leave immediately. However, my optimism dwindled as I spotted a recent model SUV neatly parked under the carport of a small, well-maintained blue house. I noticed with concern that the roof had already lost patches of shingles, and the screen door at the main entrance was ripped open and flattened against the house, stubbornly hanging on by a twisted hinge despite the wind's fury. The carriage lamps on either side of the carport were illuminated, casting a sickly yellow glow in the dim daylight. I powered down the engine and once again grasped the microphone. Jess, it's Sam. Do you read me? I've reached the last house and will be heading back shortly. I winced as a brief burst of static responded, possibly carrying traces of a voice. Twice more I tried to contact her, with identical results. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and I knew that my chance to escape the island was quickly diminishing. Every fiber of my being urged me to turn back now and leave the island, but I couldn't convince myself to restart the Jeep without at least a quick check of the house. The distinction between life and death for anyone possibly inside that house could be profound, and I wasn't certain I could forgive myself if, after coming this far, I left people to face the storm's fury simply because I didn't take a few minutes to make sure. With a resigned exhale, I zipped my jacket and pulled up the hood, securing it tightly around my face. I grasped the door handle and pushed, battling against the wind's attempt to keep me indoors. It felt almost sentient, as if the storm possessed its own consciousness and intentions, resisting any interference from me. With one final forceful effort, I overcame the resistance, swinging the door open just enough to step into the chaotic nightmare the barrier island had transformed into. A sudden gust wrenched the door from my grip and slammed it shut, simultaneously thrusting me back against the 4x4. The wind's howl was even more deafening outside, tearing through the underbrush with a dreadful, unending hiss that occasionally wavered in intensity, but never truly abated. It produced eerie, shrieking sounds as it weaved through the trees and scrub, unsettling and foreign. I squinted against the rain, surveying the expanse of unwelcoming vegetation. I was captivated by the undulating motion, compelled by the storm's approach. The turbulent sway of wind-driven palmettos, coupled with the dim afternoon light, played tricks on my eyes, conjuring elusive shadows that seemed to materialize and vanish at will. Here, the crashing rumble of the surf was audible less than 100 yards away. The salt and the stinging spray touched my exposed skin painfully. The tremors of the furious sea resonated beneath my feet. Chiding myself for squandering precious time, I leaned into the wind and sprinted toward the front door of the house. Through the closed blinds of a nearby window, I caught a glimpse of a flickering television. My thoughts once more turned to an image of an elderly couple, or perhaps a solitary, fearful widow huddled inside, helpless, hiding from the encroaching tempest. Maybe they had intended to evacuate, but were trapped indoors as the sky grew ominous. It's possible they had nowhere to flee and had accepted whatever destiny the storm had in store for them. I directed my gaze towards the silver SUV nestled in the carport. It possessed an air of luxury and comfort, yet it was evident that it was designed for smooth asphalt roads, not the muddied mess that the dirt path had deteriorated into. Despite its outward allure, I was aware that it lacked both four-wheel drive capability and tires suitable for navigating the slippery and hazardous route that had brought me here. If the occupants had delayed their evacuation until the dirt road transformed into a quagmire, their attempt to depart would have faltered within mere feet from their driveway. Whether they were still present remained uncertain despite their likely awareness of this fact. I turned my attention and forcefully struck the door with the heel of my fist, noticing the recent scars etched into the painted surface. The wind had escalated in its ferocity, and I could only speculate about the kind of debris flung from the nearby shrubland that had caused the deep gouges and marks on its wooden exterior. Cupping my hands around my mouth, I leaned closer to the door. "Hello, is anyone indoors? I'm here to assist you. Staying here is not safe. We must leave," I cried out, my voice sounding feeble against the deafening cacophony engulfing me. I paused for a moment, awaiting any response from within, but only silence echoed back. I grappled with a dilemma at that instant. According to all logical reasoning, my obligation had been fulfilled, and prudence dictated my departure. It was plausible that the residents had a secondary vehicle they used for evacuation, perhaps leaving without the forethought to turn off the television. Maybe a family member had fetched them, or they had summoned a taxi, or even departed with a neighbor days prior. All these scenarios were feasible, yet I needed assurance. I grasped the doorknob, turning it with a silent plea for it to be locked. Under my breath, I cursed as it yielded, swinging the door ajar. Swiftly, I stepped inside and shut the door behind me, muffling most of the storm's fury. The transition was stark. The entire day had been spent in an open-topped Jeep, assaulted by escalating winds and rain, leading to an adjustment to the storm's unrelenting clamor. Now, however, I found myself in a meticulously arranged living room adorned with the familiar tropical motif ubiquitous in every beachside motel along the Sunshine State. The television blared, its volume seemingly too high amidst the partially muted storm sounds. The local meteorologist's recognizable face occupied the screen, poised against the backdrop of a green-screened, computer-generated storm map. The tempest was on the brink of attaining Category 5 status. Animated and erratic images portrayed the cyclone's relentless advance over the past 12 hours. As Jess had informed me, the predicted path of the hurricane had indeed shifted. Instead of hugging the coastline towards the Panhandle, it now indicated a rightward veer at the Bay Inlet, propelling it directly towards us. This situation was destined to turn dire. "Hello?" I exclaimed loudly, tearing my gaze from the television. I needed to act swiftly. There was no time for hesitation. By now, I should have already been gone for 10 minutes. In fact, I should have left an hour ago, comfortably settled in the cozy haven of the rally point, sipping subpar coffee alongside fellow volunteers. How much longer would the bridge remain accessible to me? It was a drawbridge, and I was aware that during storms, they often raised such bridges to prevent blockage of the waterway, in case the bridge sustained damage and became unusable. As I moved through room after empty room in my passage through the house, I observed with curiosity the open suitcases strewn across a bed in one of the compact bedrooms. I couldn't ascertain whether they had recently been unpacked by an incoming guest or arranged there in anticipation of an evacuation. Regardless, I couldn't afford to expend time fretting over it. I pressed on, eventually finding myself at the back of the house. I stood on the threshold of a spacious Florida room, once an open porch but now enclosed and lined with windows. The bamboo blinds had all been neatly rolled up, offering an unrestricted view through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was a sight unlike any I had witnessed before, an upfront perspective of the tumultuous Gulf waters and the impending hurricane's core. The turbulent waters lay astonishingly close from this vantage point, mere 30 yards away from where I stood. The walls and roof creaked under the assault of the wind, and I momentarily fixated on the awe-inspiring spectacle of nature's wrath unfurling before me. From a distance I caught the sharp crack resembling a gunshot, and the house plunged into darkness as the lights flickered off, silencing the television in the living room. I understood that this signaled a nearby transformer had blown, and it was improbable that power would be reinstated for several days, if not weeks, depending on the extent of the hurricane's havoc across the region. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and what we were currently experiencing were merely the outer bands. When the hurricane's main body struck land, conditions would perilously worsen. 2 high-backed rattan chairs occupied the space, a chair facing outward, offering a view of the beach and the tumultuous ocean, and another overturned, as if it had been knocked aside, possibly as the occupants hurried to collect a few belongings before evacuating. A pair of empty beer bottles and a set of binoculars adorned the small round table nestled between them. The forceful howl of the wind grabbed my attention, directing my gaze to the exterior door on my right. The door was partially ajar, caught in the swollen wooden frame. Without hesitation, I walked towards it and firmly pulled it shut, making sure the latch engaged. It was astonishing that the wind hadn't torn the door off its hinges yet. Luck had it that the door had slammed shut forcefully enough to get wedged in the frame. With a sense of assurance that the house was devoid of occupants, I allowed myself one final glance out at the turbulent waters. The thick blanket of clouds hanging ominously low gave me an unsettling feeling. The clouds seemed almost within arm's reach of the water's surface, swirling and twirling with an unfathomable rage. Amidst the chaos of the storm, my mind attempted to discern patterns, conjuring imaginary shapes that flickered in and out of existence within the tempestuous cloud cover. Turning away from the wall of windows, I hastened my steps towards my jeep, intending to commence my own evacuation. However, I suddenly halted in my tracks as my gaze landed on the high-backed chair, still standing upright. The shock hit me suddenly, and it took a moment for my brain to process what I was witnessing. When understanding finally dawned on me, I staggered back involuntarily, a cold shiver running down my spine. The man was unquestionably deceased. My basic first aid training wasn't necessary to ascertain that fact. He wasn't elderly, in contrast to many other residents around, probably in his mid-40s or early 50s at most. He sported a vibrant tropical shirt and khaki cargo shorts that seemed a bit too large for his slender frame. His disheveled hair was a mix of black and gray strands, and his jaw was adorned with a 5-day-old stubble. However, all these specifics faded away in an instant, overshadowed by the frozen expression of sheer terror etched onto his face. His eyes were wide open, the whites surrounding his lifeless irises, while his mouth gaped, as though locked in the midst of an unimaginable and perpetual scream of horror. How long had he been deceased, his vacant gaze fixed on the expanse of water and the encroaching hurricane? That must have been the last thing he witnessed. I attempted to rationalize with myself that he had possibly suffered a heart attack due to the stress of the situation. What I interpreted as fear might have been the excruciating pain he experienced as his heart gave out, now accentuated by the rigidity of death. Isolated and alone, confronted by one of the most violent weather phenomena the area had experienced in decades, trapped in a secluded dwelling with no means of escape, the mental toll must have been immense, conceivably surpassing his physical endurance. I attempted to console myself with these thoughts, but my attention was drawn to the dark scuff marks marring the white linoleum floor, delineating a space in front of the adjacent chair. Nearby, a light beige cushion with a disheveled polka dot design lay on the ground, suggesting that the chair had been forcefully overturned. Upon closer inspection, the polka dots, ranging in shades of red and maroon, appeared moist and glossy. Stepping back, I discerned that these stains were interspersed with what I initially took to be scuff marks on the floor. It gradually dawned on me that these marks were the result of agitated footprints spreading the liquid across the polished surface. Blood. There was no other explanation, even though the source of the blood remained unseen, intensifying the grimness of the scene. My gaze followed the unsettling streaks leading to the exterior door I had recently shut. My own footprints were mingled with the marks, and a feeling of nausea washed over me as I realized I was inadvertently tracking someone's blood across their floor. Unbelievable. What transpired here? The expletive escaped my lips involuntarily as I unconsciously retreated, my back brushing against the quivering windows that adorned the room's walls. With trembling fingers, I rummaged in my pocket for my cell phone, my eyes still fixated on the lifeless figure in the chair. The screen illuminated, revealing my lack of signal, which only fueled my frustration. A sudden surge in the storm's fury rattled the foundations of the house, its angry howls penetrating the eaves. From somewhere above, an alarming crack resonated, as though the entire roof was grappling to maintain its grasp. I needed to reach my radio. I had to escape this place. The aftermath of whatever had occurred here would have to be dealt with by the authorities once the hurricane subsided. There was nothing I could do at this moment, and I was certainly ill-equipped to handle it. This was beyond my scope of responsibility. Tearing my gaze away from the lifeless form and the traces of blood, I hurried back into the house, making my way toward the now dimly lit foyer, my focus solely on finding a way out. Merely 2 steps away from the front door, I heard it. The sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was one of those rare moments during a violent storm when the wind's tumultuous dance momentarily ceased. The stillness was fleeting, lasting only a few breaths before the tempest resumed its clamor. Yet within that brief interlude, I realized that the distant howls and shrieks that I had attributed to the storm were still audible, persisting in the background. The eerie sound seemed to originate from all directions around the house, somewhat softened by the continuous patter of rain and the booming crash of the waves, yet undeniably present. I quickly looked over my shoulder, catching a glimpse of an oddly contorted shadow that fleetingly crossed the windows of the sunroom at the rear of the house, as though someone or something had hurriedly passed by. I furrowed my brow and pivoted, just as the temporary break from the wind's assault came to an end, allowing the full symphony of the storm's noises to return. What in the world is that? I pondered aloud, my mind working to piece together the fleeting image. Taking cautious steps backward toward the rear of the house, I squinted at the window-lined perspective of the Florida room. My ears strained, gradually discerning those mournful cries lurking just beneath the untamed gusts of wind. They possessed an eerie, almost supernatural quality. They were no longer mere components of the tempest. They transcended the realm of a gust of wind moving through trees and shrubbery. I suddenly realized that these sounds were disconnected from the rise and fall of the storm. No, they belonged to something else, something within the storm, yet distinct from it. A sudden scrambling ruckus drew my attention back to the front door. The noise resembled the sickening sound of someone desperately attempting to claw their way into the house as though seeking refuge. "Hello?" I ventured cautiously, although part of me was tempted to approach one of the nearby windows and cautiously peek through the drawn curtains. An instinctive unease held me back. A faint voice of caution in the recesses of my mind warned against it. It was a subtle, low murmur, advising me that I might witness something I would rather avoid. "Hello?" I repeated, raising my voice a notch, mustering my courage. "Is someone out there?" The frenzied scratching paused momentarily, only to resume with an eager, almost ravenous determination. There was unquestionably a presence outside, and I no longer entertained the notion that it was merely an individual seeking refuge from the inclement weather. I observed the doorknob quiver as whatever was assaulting the door must have accidentally jostled it. Then the scraping sounds abruptly ceased. I watched in dread as the knob trembled once more, almost tentatively, and then, to my horror, witnessed it slowly turn, inch by inch, as though manipulated by appendages never intended for such a purpose. In an instant, I lunged for the door and threw the deadbolt, abandoning all logic as a single certain thought consumed me. I absolutely did not want whatever awaited on the opposite side of that door to gain entry. Upon hearing the resounding thud of the deadbolt sliding into place, the doorknob convulsed violently for a brief moment before settling into an eerie silence. The door became a canvas for a dreadful display of frantic scratching and pounding, creating visible vibrations that danced in the dim ambient light. The cacophony ceased momentarily, and to my dismay, my gaze caught an undefined silhouette darting swiftly behind the drapes of the curtained window. In an instant, a chilling realization washed over me. The enigmatic entity was now hastening around the perimeter of the house, perhaps in search of an alternative entry point. Recalling that the side door leading to the sunroom had been left slightly ajar when I first arrived, I recollected how I had pulled it shut, ensuring the latch was engaged. Locking it hadn't crossed my mind at the time. Why would it have? Summoning my resolve, I propelled my feet forward, gliding across the slick tile flooring as I swiftly traversed the shadow-draped living room and the cozy dining area, finally emerging into the expanse illuminated by rows of windows. I lunged towards the door just as a shadowy figure maneuvered around the corner of the house, its movements marked by an awkward and stumbling gait that defied its remarkable speed. Had my actions been a few seconds more sluggish, my fate would have been sealed. Yet, with the grace of Providence, I reached the door and slid the bolt into place, just as the entity emerged entirely from the blurred curtain of rain, coming to a sudden halt. Merely a thin pane of glass now separated me from the chilling presence that stood before me. Describing the entity even now proves a daunting task. It bore a semblance to a human figure, but one stretched to unnatural heights, with limbs elongated to an unsettling degree, and joints that twisted in unnatural directions. Its motions seemed as though it was still struggling to gain mastery over its own body. It spasmed and shuddered, even in its stillness, its gaze fixed upon me through two lifeless black voids where its eyes should have been. Its chest heaved in a steady rhythm of shallow breaths, unerring in their pace throughout the duration of my observation. Its flesh displayed a disconcerting pattern of mottled greens and grays, at times hanging loosely like ill-fitting attire, and at others pulled taut across its form, threatening to rupture. My gaze discerned jagged lacerations scattered across its form, releasing a sickly amber fluid that seemed to ooze from recent wounds. The elongated torso was nearly skeletal, the count of ribs discernible as if its flesh had been stripped away. Above, the skin and tendons appeared to converge like the drawstrings of a decaying leather pouch, forming the gaunt neck of the entity. Although its appearance suggested a state of emaciation, an unsettling sense pervaded that this was the intended, natural form of this grotesque aberration. Yet the head was the pinnacle of horror, a visage that I'm certain will haunt my dreams every time I shut my eyes, for as long as my breath endures. The entity seemed devoid of sight, a detail I previously noted due to the lack of any discernible eyes within its malformed and disproportionately large skull. Its nose manifested as a pair of narrow, raw lesions etched into the taut surface of its face, oozing the same repulsive amber fluid mentioned before. The sight of its mouth. Oh, dear Jesus, that mouth. It resembled more of a torn and ragged gash, stretching too far from one side of its skull to the other, essentially splitting its face in half. Where the jaws met, countless ill-fitting needle-like teeth protruded at random angles, their ebony sheen gleaming in the relentless downpour. It was as if this entity had been conceived in the midst of a feverish nightmare, drawing horrors from the deepest pits of terror. As I stood there, gripped by an immobilizing fear, the creature leaned closer to the door's window. It tilted its head almost quizzically, as though attempting to decipher the invisible barrier that separated us. With each movement, its jaw twitched minutely, opening and closing rhythmically in small spasms of uncontrollable motion. At one juncture, the jaws stretched wide and then snapped shut with such suddenness and intensity that I could distinctly hear the sound through the door, above the howling wind. It was akin to the sharp clap of two heavy sticks being struck together. There was no doubt in my mind about the fate that awaited me if I were caught between those monstrous jaws. Despite my instinctual desire to close my eyes tightly and shut out the abomination before me, my gaze remained fixated. My eyes took in every detail, the the shortened webbing between its clawed four-fingered hands, the cluster of barnacles positioned just below its ribcage, and the stringy remnants of seagrass clinging to the spiny growths protruding from its limbs. With sudden conviction, I realized that this creature had emerged from the depths. It hailed from those impenetrably dark places far beneath the water's surface, where sunlight held no sway and the world of man remained oblivious. The existence of such a repulsive aberration seemed implausible, yet here it stood before me, undoubtedly a predator. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the creature, even though I fought desperately to maintain my sanity. I clung to the fraying shreds of my composure, struggling against the looming threat of madness. The passage of time stretched on as we both remained motionless. I dared not make a single movement, fearing that even the slightest twitch would draw its attention. Meanwhile, the creature seemed to sense that I was still present, although I grew increasingly convinced that it couldn't see me directly. A gust of wind surged once more, and from somewhere nearby, the distinct sound of a tree yielding to the unrelenting onslaught reached my ears, a crack followed by a deep, resonating crash. Captivated by the unfamiliar noise, the creature before me snapped its head toward the source of the sound. In an instant it blurred into motion, vanishing into the heavy rain before I could fully comprehend what was unfolding. In a split second, I made my choice. Pivoting and dashing with all my might toward the front of the house, I burst through the door, my heart pounding, and raced onto the shell drive where my Jeep awaited, my only refuge. To my right, amidst the palmetto scrub, I caught a glimpse of something dreadful hurtling toward me. Then, to my terror, another figure emerged, like a decaying specter from the rooftop. Meanwhile, the sounds of frantic movement to my left spurred me on. I slammed into the side of my Jeep, feeling the pain, but wasted no time in wrenching the door open and throwing myself inside. How many of them were there? How many could possibly exist? Without a single moment's hesitation, I turned the key in the ignition and shifted the Jeep into gear. The tires spun fiercely as I surged forward, leaving the desolate house behind. I raced down the lengthy driveway, buckling my seatbelt absent-mindedly, too afraid to check if I was being chased. All I had to do was reach the main road, and then I could escape from this island. The bridge was only a couple of miles away, my lifeline, but I knew that a half-mile of muddy, slippery dirt road stood between me and the nearest paved path, making my progress excruciatingly slow. I maintained the highest speed I dared on the shell drive, navigating the twists and turns cautiously as the oversized off-road tires struggled for traction. Water sprayed from both sides of the Jeep, the rising levels sometimes obstructing my view of the driveway itself. Abruptly, static erupted from the radio speakers. Through the interference, Jess's voice could be heard, distorted and indistinct. I couldn't make out the words, but her anxious tone was unmistakable. Straining my eyes on the road ahead, my windshield wipers barely able to combat the onslaught of rain, I reached out with my right hand to grasp the radio handset. I needed to communicate what was happening, to ensure that someone was aware of my approach, that they would keep the bridge accessible for a little while longer. My fingers brushed against the handset just as my tires hit a sharp dip in the drive, jolting me violently and causing the microphone to tumble to the floor. I cursed, struggling to keep the Jeep steady on the nearly invisible path, then blindly reached for the radio handset by my feet. The speaker screeched once more as Jess attempted to reach me. Her words remained unintelligible, but her urgency was palpable. Amidst the chaos, she was trying to convey something, her message fraught with importance even if its content eluded me. Frustration boiled within me as I pounded the steering wheel, all while I continued my blind search for the handset as the palmetto scrub on either side blurred past, appearing as muted green splotches through the rain's onslaught. Had I not been so preoccupied, I would have retained the memory of how the shell drive concluded abruptly around a curve, merging with the treacherous mire of the flooded dirt road. I would have been ready for the transition. I've spent innumerable hours navigating even more challenging terrains in this Jeep. It was fully equipped to handle them as long as the driver upheld their end. The error was mine. I charged around a curve at nearly 40 miles per hour, the thick cluster of palm trees concealing the path ahead until it was too tardy. I collided with the mailbox at full throttle, the hefty wooden post snapping off at ground level and vanishing beneath my steel bumper with a resounding crash. I sensed the unmistakable loss of grip as my tires sank into the slippery and deceitful mud, rendering me entirely powerless over the 4x4, now subject to the dictates of my momentum. The weighty Jeep skidded across the modest turnaround, swerving wildly as it did so. I sensed the forceful tires bulldozing through the mire as I veered sideways, the opposite side of the road hurtling toward me through the passenger window. I departed from the road at speed, descending the shallow embankment into the swampy palmetto scrubland beyond. I only had a fleeting moment to perceive the tires abruptly finding traction in the marshy terrain before the Jeep tilted, and my world descended into darkness. I can't ascertain how much time I was unconscious. It probably wasn't too prolonged, I assumed. The Jeep rested on its wheels. Although the windshield was shattered, the steel frame ominously crumpled towards me. The engine lay silent, and the canvas top torn by the violent entry into the unforgiving Florida undergrowth. Groggily, I looked upwards at the roll bar that likely preserved my life, slightly askew but predominantly intact. The seatbelt, which I had reflexively fastened as I began my descent, clung painfully across my chest and hips, the clasp obstinately resisting my efforts to unfasten it. My head ached, and as I swept my hand across my face to clear my sight from the encroaching rainwater, it emerged disturbingly crimson. I attempted the ignition, but the key produced no response when I turned it. Similarly, the radio remained lifeless. The only sounds enveloping me were those of the wind and the rain facing the impending hurricane, and something else, just beneath the chaotic cacophony of the tempest. Something within the storm, yet distinct from it, drawing nearer.